Should I hit continue?
Yes, please.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Janet Baker, Curator of Asian Art at Phoenix Art Museum. Arizona State University and Phoenix Art Museum welcome you to the 2022 annual Marilyn A. Papp Chinese Painting Symposium. Please note, we request that you type any questions into the chat feature for today's program. This year, we are honored to welcome a colleague who possesses a rare and wonderful combination of knowledge and talents. Arnold Chang, 中文名字张宏, has studied art history with James Cahill, but also become a contemporary Chinese ink painter of international recognition. He studied with C.C. Wang. He's also participated in the global Chinese market at Sotheby's, New York and Hong Kong, and at Kaikudo, New York. This gives him a unique perspective from which to consider the questions so relevant in today's global culture. What is Chinese ink painting, and how has it evolved in the past century through political, economic, and artistic changes? We are delighted to welcome Arnold Chang to address this topic.
Thank you so much, Janet, for the introduction, and thank you to ASU and the Phoenix Art Museum, with whom I've participated many times over the years. So I'll just jump right in if that's all right. In recent years, we have seen a blossoming of interest in a category of art called ink painting or ink art. Especially during the last decade, there have appeared major and minor exhibitions. Sorry. Okay, there we go. At institutions large and small, public and private, museums, auction houses, and galleries. It seems we are drowning in ink. We've seen fresh ink at the MFA Boston, ink art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Shui Mo, water ink at Sotheby's, New York, contemporary ink art at Sotheby's, Hong Kong, Chinese contemporary ink at Christie's in Hong Kong, on the left, a painting by Li Huayi, and a calligraphy, I guess you call it calligraphy, by Shubei. We've been in ink, we've gone beyond ink. We've discovered ink worlds, and we've begun to have ink dreams. But the actual term shui mo hua, literally water ink painting, has only become popular, at least in its current usage in recent times. It's a term now used frequently to describe a wide range of artworks for which ink, usually but not always applied with a brush, constitutes the primary medium of expression. At various times in history, other terms have been used to describe the kind of painting shown here by Zhongwu Chang in the Phoenix Art Museum. Painted in 1929, it falls under the broad category of shuhua, painting and calligraphy, a term that would be used throughout most of Chinese dynastic history. Shuhua emphasizes the coupling of calligraphy and painting, which were both done with a brush and ink, and were generally portable and mounted in traditional formats, such as hanging scrolls, hand scrolls, albums, and fans, the kind of paintings that you see in a museum and can easily recognize as a Chinese painting, unless of course it's Japanese or Korean, which is another problem. Throughout much of China's later periods, the term wenrenhua, literati painting, would also apply. Wenrenhua is a term that has a long and complicated history. It originated in the Northern Song dynasty to describe the art of a group of like-minded intellectuals, the so-called scholar artists or literati, who practiced calligraphy and painting as an avocation, a leisure activity and means of self-cultivation akin to poetry. Often poetry, calligraphy, and painting were combined in a single work or in various combinations. But initially, literati painting was not defined by any particular style or subject matter. In fact, it had more to do with the creator's attitude towards the creative process and his social status as a man of culture. By the Yuan period in the 14th century, literati painting became associated with certain styles, particularly landscape, and a style of painting that was certain subjects, particularly landscape, and a style of painting that was more subdued and less flashy, emphasizing the painter's personal expression over technical proficiency. In theory, literati painters were amateurs who embraced the self-defined aesthetic of elegant ineptitude. But in the Ming Dynasty, the literati aesthetic became more and more intertwined with commerce. And by the late Qing, the term literati painting was defined more by style and subject matter than by the status of the artist. This kind of painting became a cultural commodity, which collectors could acquire to demonstrate their sophisticated taste. As China transitioned from the Qing Dynasty to become a modern nation, the term literati painting became increasingly suspect as a symbol of elitism that did not accord with the goals of moving towards a more egalitarian society. And of course, it was totally unacceptable after the Communist Revolution in 1949. 中国画, Chinese painting, was a term that was needed to distinguish it from other kinds of art, as China increasingly came to terms with the outside world. And it was generally used in opposition to Xihua, Western painting, or Youhua, oil painting. But as time went on, Chinese artists began working in a range of media. So in some contexts, using the term Chinese painting to refer only to works done with ink seemed exclusionary. Guohua, or national painting, is a simplification of Zhongguohua and generally refers to ink painting. But defining what type of painting represents the nation at any particular time in history is also problematic. 水墨画, water ink painting, has its origins in the Tang Dynasty, where it refers to works that were drawn with ink as opposed to painted with color. But the term is not used much until it reappears in the 20th century. In its modern usage, it refers to ink as a medium, such as watercolor or oil paint. My first teacher, Wang Jiren, popularized the term. He had traveled to Europe and Japan in the 1920s and 1930s and taught Western painting in Shanghai. Here are a couple of examples of his work, an oil painting and a watercolor. Wang emigrated to the US in the early 1940s and established a school of Chinese brushwork in 1947. He reinvented himself as an ink painter because his students were almost exclusively Caucasian Americans. I guess he figured that teaching water ink painting made more sense than teaching Chinese painting. He created a hybrid style that to me is more like watercolor done with ink than what I think of as a Chinese painting. I believe this was his intention, to decouple the nationality from the medium. He wanted to update the tools and techniques of ink painting that had been used by the Chinese artists for centuries to depict new subjects and simultaneously encourage the participation of non-Chinese artists. At the same time, in China, the term 水墨画 was gradually gaining in popularity as a neutral label for describing Chinese paintings of the pre-modern era. Xie Zhiliu, a famous connoisseur and painter, published a history of Chinese painting dating back to ancient times, and he titled the book 水墨画. This version was printed in Hong Kong in 1973, but I presume that it was written earlier. Another set of terms that we have to grapple with when studying Chinese painting of the 20th century have to do with whether we characterize the artworks in temporal terms or in stylistic terms. and how we translate these concepts from English or other languages into Chinese. I find that terms like modern and contemporary are not used consistently in either Chinese or English, but that's just the nature of language. In China, the term xiandai, modern, is often used in opposition to 传统, which means traditional, when referring to different kinds of ink painting. Did you know? My advanced thing didn't work. Did you know that the Metropolitan Museum presented 2 exhibitions of 20th century Chinese paintings in the 1940s? In 1943, an exhibition of modern Chinese paintings featured the work of Wang Jiren and 15 other artists, mainly his friends. The 1948 show was called Contemporary Chinese Paintings and included a wider range of artists. So the terminology varies from time to time and it's not consistent. The title of the 2007 catalog, A Tradition Redefined, Modern and Contemporary Chinese Ink Paintings from the Zhu Li Collection, 1950 to 2000, covers all the bases, but it's a mouthful. The title 20th Century Chinese Painting defines the era under consideration without attempting to categorize the style of the paintings included. My classmate and good friend, Judy Andrews, and her husband, Kui Yishen, have produced 2 seminal publications on the art of 20th century China, which identify and discuss in great detail and with great objectivity and sensitivity the complex issues of history, politics, identity, and aesthetics of the past century. Readers of English are now fortunate to have access to a wealth of information condensed into very readable texts. The basic narrative, in its simplest form, that forms the backdrop for the art of the period goes something like this. During the 20th century, the place we know as China underwent an incredible political and social transformation. At the beginning of the century, in 1900, China was still under the control of the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty. After a series of devastating military defeats at the hands of the Japanese and European powers, in 1911, the Qing were overthrown and the Republic of China was established. By mid-century, after a brutal civil war, China was split in 2, as the victorious communists proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the defeated nationalists fled to Taiwan, where they established a government in exile. Because of the political situation, even straightforward terms like China or Chinese suddenly required further explanation. Do they refer to nationality, ethnicity, or something else? What did it mean to be a Chinese artist? Excuse me, how do we define Chinese art? Additionally, a century of nearly continuous warfare left the Chinese battered and exhausted, physically, economically, and psychologically. For perhaps the first time in history, they began to question not only their political systems and institutions, but also their age-old cultural values. Historical circumstances forced an increased engagement with foreign ideas about all subjects, including art and aesthetics. Leading Chinese intellectuals realized that China needed to modernize in order to compete with the West and Japan. But many feared that as China developed into a modern nation, she would be in danger of losing her distinctive cultural identity. How could Chinese artists transform their backward-looking artistic traditions into something progressive and forward-looking? What kinds of new vocabulary and terminology were required to debate these issues? This was the cultural dilemma in which artists found themselves. Professor Zhu Li, writing in 1969, explained, quote, painting for more than 1,000 years, one of the highest forms of cultural achievement in China, offers a fascinating subject for our scrutiny of the complexities of modern China. Together with poetry and calligraphy, the act of painting has always been a practice of intellectuals. Historically, Chinese painting is the longest uninterrupted painting tradition among the world's cultures today, and the quantity of surviving works, theoretical treatises, technical manuals, historical discussions, and documentary writings is unmatched anywhere else. Yet today, as never before, this tradition has come under the severest of attacks and challenges, both from within and from without. For this reason, a study of the modern development of Chinese painting provides us with the means not only to investigate the problem of artistic representation and expression, but also to gain an insight into some of the salient intellectual issues of modern China. A bitter debate was waged about how Chinese painting should best respond to modernity. At the extremes were those who believed in upholding tradition at all costs, and on the other side, those who advocated a complete overhaul of Chinese society. The traditionalists advocated the revitalization of native Chinese culture and rejected the idea of wholesale Westernization, which they feared would lead to a loss of a distinctive national character. At the other extreme were reform-minded intellectuals, many of whom had been educated in the West, who argued that China's cultural tradition was in fact an unsurmountable obstacle to modernization, and that the only way to create a new society was to completely discard the old institutions, feudal beliefs, and outmoded ideas of the old China in order to begin anew. Visual artists and art critics were naturally embroiled in the debate, which had obvious consequences for the future of Chinese painting. During the first half of the century, artists gave visual form to these debates. During the 20s, traditional style artists such as Wu Changshuo continued to develop their own personal interpretations of traditional themes, which to their eyes were very modern in comparison to the works of painters of previous generations. Traditional style landscape painters agreed that Chinese painting, guohua, especially shanshui, landscape painting, had indeed lost some of its vigor at the end of the Qing dynasty. But they saw this as the natural ebb and flow of stylistic evolution that was embodied in the tradition itself. They believed that there was nothing inherently wrong with China's artistic and cultural values, and that the decline in recent Chinese art was due more to an inadequate understanding of traditional aesthetics rather than as a result of ignorance of foreign artistic traditions. Their proposed solution was to delve deeper into the past, to rediscover and reclaim the greatness of China's artistic heritage. Chen Hongke, sometimes called Chen Hong Tre, and Zheng Wuchang were two of the most vocal and articulate advocates for preserving the aesthetic qualities of ink painting while dampening its admittedly elitist tendencies. They argued for updating the tradition rather than simply preserving it or destroying it. Others, like the influential artist and educator Shubei, who had studied oil painting in Europe, advocated a radical revamping of art and art education. During the early years of the Republic, a great many institutional reforms were enacted, including the adoption of a Western-style educational system and the establishment of art academies, in which, for the most part, Western art was emphasized and Chinese art was treated as a secondary subject or not at all. Shubei Hong had won the ideological debate, but at least for a time, traditional style works coexisted with Western style oil paintings. While Western art received governmental and institutional support, traditional style artists banded together and formed privately funded local art groups and a national organization called the Chinese Painting Society. Here you see oil paintings by Shubei Hong and Wang Jiren. It should be noted that while both Xu and Wang advocated adopting Western techniques, their choice of which models to embrace were quite different. Shubei preferred a type of academic realism, while Wang Jiren embraced post-impressionism. And while Xiaosun, Shubei, and Pantian Shou were all considered traditional ink style painters, they also followed different stylistic lineages. So the simplistic East-West, traditional modern dichotomies don't really hold up, whether you're talking about oil painting or ink painting. In addition to Shubei and Wang Jiren, there were other artists who developed hybrid styles that combined elements of Western and Chinese painting. Gao Jianfu studied in Japan and hoped that China would emulate Japan's path to modernization. Liu Haisu studied in France and painted in both oils and ink. Lin Fengmian, also educated in France, was a very popular artist who developed a unique style of ink painting that was influenced by European painting, but emphasized the bold calligraphic use of line. These artists were all influential in advocating for a new type of Chinese painting. Throughout the decade of the 40s, these trends continued to play out. Conservative artists like Wu Hufan, who was Cixi Wang's teacher, continued to paint tasteful classical landscape. Huang Binhong and Fu Baoshi continued in their quest to update traditional formats. Shubei still works in oils, but increasingly is turning to ink painting. Here he does two versions of the same figural composition, one in oils, one in ink, and an early version of what will become the ubiquitous, iconic galloping horse. At this point, the narrative becomes much more complicated. With the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the retreat of the nationalist government to Taiwan, everything changes. As Judy Andrews and Kuei Yishen summarized, this is how they summarized what happened after Mao's government took power. Quote, Chinese painting in the 20th century has suffered a cataclysmic fate. However, that has little to do, at least directly, with these artistic issues or with its own internal dynamics. Identified by well-meaning but often ill-informed political reformers with all that was backward in China's pre-modern culture, Chinese painting was first challenged or ridiculed, then suppressed, and finally all but eradicated in China's 20th century rush towards utopian modernities. The communist government, by abolishing private societies, eliminated in one sweep the institutional foundations for modern guohua. Further, by adopting ill-informed and iconoclastic views of guohua, similar to those of Chen Duxiu, who was the co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party, the new art establishment began the destruction of Chinese painting. It was made clear to artists that landscape was feudal and unpatriotic. Most responded by trying to paint figures, however poorly. Those who persisted in their personal artistic explorations were, if lucky, completely ignored. More often, they were subjected to various attempts at re-education. Most of the relatively cosmopolitan goals of the Chinese Painting Society were no longer possible. The second half of the 20th century is too complex to summarize in a few words. So this is where I feel a need to recalibrate. You can sense the desperation in these comments by Andrews and Shun, a feeling which was shared not only by the artists living in China, but by anyone who was practicing or studying traditional Chinese paintings. Americans, I think, are well aware of the repressive nature of the PRC with regards to freedom of expression. Chairman Mao himself stated that there was no such thing as art for art's sake. All art was meant to be used in the service of the people. Westerners tend to focus on the fact that China closed her doors to the outside world, and as a result, Chinese artists had no access to the modern art movements of the 20th century in Europe, Japan, and America. What isn't emphasized enough is the devastating effect that communist reforms had on ink painting, which was nearly eradicated completely. Those of us who have spent a lifetime studying and appreciating this great art form felt obligated to defend it. So we can't get into all the details, but fortunately you can read the book that Judy and Shubei have written. I want to try a different, more visual approach. I'm grateful to adopt the category of shui mo hua, or ink painting, because while the period from 1950 to 2000 presents a disjuncture in the narrative of the development of Chinese art, ink painting, shui mo hua, somehow survived, and 20th century ink painting can still be relatively comfortably fit into the centuries-old history of shui mo hua ink painting. Let's take a look at the work of 4 artists whose lives span nearly the entire 20th century. All of them were born in the Qing dynasty and lived to see the establishment of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. 2 of them left China and 2 of them remained and suffered through the Cultural Revolution, but managed to keep painting traditional subjects with traditional materials. Zhang Daqian was one of the most prolific and versatile Chinese painters of the 20th century. From an early age, he was accomplished in virtually all painting styles, from fine line to broad brush, and could paint just about any subject: flowers, figures, landscapes, even animals. His forgeries of the old masters brought him both fame and notoriety. Here you can get an idea of the range of his skills in the 1920s and 30s. In the 1940s, he continued to emulate the old masters. On the far left is a monochrome landscape based on the composition by the Qing master Bada Shanren, 1626 to 1705. And on the far right, a landscape modeled with a landscape with color that's modeled after a style of Dong Qichang, 1555 to 1636. He was also a great collector of ancient masterpieces and considered one of the finest connoisseurs of the modern era. In 1941, Zhang made a trip to Dunhuang in Gansu province in northwest China to study and copy the ancient Buddhist cave temples there. The second painting from the left was painted upon his arrival to the area just before he entered the cave complex. The third painting is based on his Dunhuang copies and demonstrates how Zhang Daqian embraced and revitalized a tradition of brightly colored, fine line ink figure painting that had rarely been practiced for centuries. He expanded his repertoire to include styles and subjects that were outside the range of typical literati painters. Zhang left China before the communists took power in 1949 because he knew that his lavish lifestyle and elitist tastes would not be tolerated in the new China. And he never returned to the mainland. He traveled the world and subsequently lived in India, Argentina, Brazil, Carmel, California, and finally Taiwan. The painting of an Indian dancer is based on Zhang's study of the famous cave paintings at Ajanta, India, which he visited in 1950. The slightly erotic painting of a lady at rest shows the influence of Japanese ukiyo-e prints combined with the sinuous flowing lines of his Dunhuang figures. The painting on the right records a visit to Niagara Falls that Zhang made with a few of his fellow expatriate artists, including C.C. Wang. I think this is better, actually, sorry. Oops. Anyway, sorry about that. Zhang's style underwent a dramatic change in the 1960s. He developed a manner of painting called splashed ink and color. He began by pouring or dripping ink or color directly onto the paper and then manipulated the flow of pigment by moving the paper and coaxing it with a brush. The natural patterns that arose as the ink and color was absorbed into the paper were then developed into plausible semi-abstract compositions. Details such as trees and houses could be added, but there was less emphasis on line and more attention paid to creating a dynamic compositional rhythm. This emphasis on the controlled accident is clearly related to abstract expressionism, and even though Zhang maintained the persona of an ancient Chinese scholar, he was certainly familiar with Western abstract works, which he encountered on his many travels. But Zhang's move towards abstraction also coincided with damage to his vision caused by diabetes, which began in the late 1950s and became increasingly severe as time went on. He was unable to paint very detailed work, so he adapted and invented new Chinese painting techniques. Zhang Daqian moved to Taiwan in 1976. In spite of his failing eyesight, he continued to produce large numbers of paintings up until his death in Taipei in 1983. Li Quran, like me, was the son of restaurant owners. He studied painting at the Shanghai Art Academy. His early work consists largely of figure painting done in a very free, spontaneous manner, but he also did copies of older masterworks, like the 1943 landscape after Bada Shanren. At various times, he also studied with older traditional artists such as Shubei and Huang Binhong. He later learned Western drawing and painting techniques from the French artist André Claudeau, who taught at the Westlake Art Academy. During the 1950s, under the new regime, artists were encouraged to modernize Chinese landscape painting by depicting actual scenes of modern life in the new China instead of copying the old masters. Sketching from life became a requirement, and artists took advantage of government-sponsored trips to view and sketch the landscapes of China's provinces. In 1957, Li Quran had the opportunity to travel to East Germany for 4 months, where he created a number of realistic paintings done with ink. Li gradually developed a personal style that combined some elements of Western perspective with traditional literati techniques. One strategy that many landscape painters employed to make their works more ideologically acceptable was to illustrate lines from Chairman Mao's poetry or to depict sites that were important in the history of the Communist Revolution. Adding lots of red was also a good strategy. Li Quran's mature style of the 1970s emphasizes strong contrasts of light and dark, which creates a sense of drama. The painting in the center conveys a monumentality, almost like Northern Sung painting. But if you look carefully, you can see a group of soldiers holding up red flags. The artist's inscription identifies the scene as Jingang Mountains, where Mao established the first revolutionary base of the Chinese Communist Party. In 1974, during the Cultural Revolution, Li Quran, along with other artists, incurred the wrath of Jiang Qing, Madame Mao, who became something like the cultural commissar. She accused Li and others of painting Hei Hua, black paintings, that did not properly convey the spirit of modern China. They were literally blacklisted. Painting a revolutionary site was a loophole that allowed Li to continue to explore dramatic contrasts of tonality. He could also just lighten everything up and still create dramatic contrasts, as in the painting on the right. During the 1980s, when the madness of the Cultural Revolution had ended, Li Kuran went back to painting his dark, gloomy landscapes. In addition to his landscapes, he had always enjoyed depicting scenes of water buffalo and herd boys, which he continued to produce throughout his career. And I'm showing you one from the very end of his life. Luyan Shao is not that well known outside of China, but he's one of my favorite artists. Like all traditional painters of the time, he began his artistic training by imitating the works of the Qing dynasty masters and gradually moving back in time to study earlier literati artists of the Yuan and Ming periods. It's hard to find examples of Lu's earliest works, but a beautiful landscape painted in 1940 happens to be on view right now at the Metropolitan Museum, and it demonstrates Lu's deep understanding of the literati aesthetic at an early age. The central painting is an interpretation of the great Yuan dynasty painter Li Zan's simple compositional structure, consisting of a group of foreground trees, a great expanse of water, and a row of distant mountains. The 1956 work on the right is an example of Luyan Shao's willingness to change his painting style entirely, to try to adhere to the mandates of the new government, which is insisted on more realistic depictions of modern life and prioritized figure paintings over landscapes. During the 1960s, he continued to paint figural scenes of happy fishermen and farmers, basically propaganda pictures extolling the triumphs of the Communist Party. But you can see from the powerful image in the center that he was really a much better landscape painter. Luyan Shao went back to painting in the landscape painting in the 1970s, but like Li Kuran, often had to bathe the mountains in red, as in the example on the left, or include an electric power station, as in the middle example from the Phoenix Art Museum collection, in order to avoid criticism. After Mao's death in 1976 and the subsequent arrest of Jiang Qing, Madame Mao, censorship was reduced and Luyan Shao continued to develop his landscape style. His late landscapes are full of energy that is conveyed through bold brushwork and strong contrasts of positive and negative space. He loves to depict bands of hard-edged mists that cut through the rocks like daggers. Last but certainly not least, my teacher, the great C.C. Wang Jiren, who spent the second half of his life in New York. He started off as the most conservative of the four artists that I've shown. From a very early age, he emulated the works of the old masters, particularly the literati painters of the Yuan dynasty. Wang came from a very learned and prominent Suzhou family and was fortunate to gain access at a young age to some of the most important collections of early Chinese paintings in private hands. His teachers, Guling Shi and Wu Hufan, were both famous connoisseurs and collectors. And for Cici, learning to paint was at first primarily a tool that allowed him to better understand old paintings. In other words, painting was an aid to connoisseurship. In the 1940s, he continued to copy the works of various old masters, sometimes combining elements from different paintings into new compositions, other times making faithful copies, and sometimes making free imitations in the manner of a certain master. Because he had access to so many great masterpieces at an early age, Wang's own standards were very high, and he developed a very sophisticated literati taste in painting. Excuse me. On the other hand, he received a modern Western education and studied law in Shanghai, while simultaneously learning painting and connoisseurship from Wu Hufan. Like Zhang Daqian, Cici left China before the communists took power. He emigrated to the US in 1949 and settled in New York. There was no market for traditional Chinese landscapes in the US at the time, so Cici initially survived by working for a firm that designed wallpaper and he even painted decorations on lamps. There are very few works of C.C. Wang dating from the 1950s because he was busy trying to survive. The painting on the left is a rare work in the medium of casing because he was trying to learn some techniques. He took classes at the Art Students League, learned Western drawing, and learned about various techniques and materials. He also realized that Western audiences tended to prefer the broad-brushed, dramatic styles of Shubei's flower paintings, which did not require a deep knowledge of Chinese painting to appreciate. So he did some works in a freer, energetic manner. By the mid-1960s and into the 70s, C.C. Wang really hit his stride, combining dramatic ink washes with nuanced brushwork and introducing new techniques of applying ink to the paper, such as imprinting random lines with crumpled paper dipped in ink. The Phoenix Art Museum has a number of these works, thanks to the donations of Jeanette Elliott, who was a friend of CC's. His best works successfully juxtapose the random textures created by the imprinted ink lines with the artist's own brushstrokes and ink and color washes, molded into compositions that remind us of Song Dynasty paintings, but are completely unique. By the 1980s, C.C. Wang was in complete control of his innovative techniques, and he used the imprinting method more sparingly and sometimes not at all. In his final years, he had an incredible burst of creativity, painting in a variety of styles and a variety of subjects. The two on the left are what he called calligraphic images, because they capture the rhythms of Chinese calligraphy, but are not readable texts. The still life and cityscape in the center display a completely unique personal style and represent, to me, a true natural and unforced synthesis of Chinese and international sensibilities. Because by this time, CC had lived in New York for more than half of his life. But as you can see from the final image here on the right, in the last year of his life, C.C. Wang made it all the way into the 20th century, yet he could still return to his roots and do a beautiful landscape in the manner of his hero, the Yuan Dynasty artist Ni Zan. If we were to just look at these images from the 1980s, I think that despite the differences in the four artists' experiences post-1949, their work still has certain elements in common, especially when compared to landscape paintings of the late Qing dynasty. They all project a sense of drama and monumentality, and each, in its own way, conveys a sense of instability. They all employ a kind of top-heavy bird's eye view in which the peaks of the mountains tower precariously above bases that are partially obscured by trees, mists, or rocky outcroppings. Stark contrasts between light and dark areas enliven the surfaces of the paintings. Aside from a lonely fisherman in Zhang's Peach Blossom Spring, the only signs indicating the presence of people are the appearance of blue rooftops in CC's work and a few houses nestled within the cliffs in Liu Yanxiao's painting. Li Keran's landscape is entirely devoid of any trace of human activity. The brushwork in these paintings does not display the sensitive, nuanced touch of late Qing Orthodox painting, a style that all of these artists practiced in their early years. But now the artists' contour lines are powerful and jagged and are often obscured or overpowered by heavy washes of ink and color. The work of these four artists, who lived through all of the turmoil of the 20th century, attests to the resiliency of their creative spirit. Each of them suffered and sacrificed. Li Keran and Liu Yanxiao endured the indignities of anti-rightist campaigns and the Cultural Revolution. C.C. Wang was displaced from his home and separated from much of his family for decades, Zhang Chen never fully recovered his eyesight despite undergoing several surgeries, yet they were all able to persevere and continue to produce powerful and personal work. We should also not underestimate the resilience of Shui Moahua, the ink painting tradition itself, which has thrived for at least 2 millennia, surviving conflict and dynastic change time and time again. I realized that the 4 artists I have featured were all born during the Qing dynasty and were old enough to have been brought up with traditional cultural values. Even as they adjusted to the modern world, they held the legacy of China's artistic heritage in great esteem. If I had a few more hours, I think it would be interesting to investigate how the next generations of artists engage with ink painting. Those who were born, say, in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, with different expectations and ideas about art. Is the medium of ink enough to connect them with the ink painting of the past, or are there other factors involved? To what extent do artists who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, for example, feel a connection with traditional art forms? Of course, we have to consider artists who were raised in the alternate Chinas of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. What is their relationship to Shui Moahua? For example, the artist Liu Guosong was born in 1929 in Anhui province, but he moved to Taiwan in 1949 and is strongly associated with the modern Chinese painting movement that developed in Taiwan and Hong Kong. His mindset was very different from that of C.C. Wang. Liu coined the phrase "down with the brush" and valued creativity over tradition. As an artist, it's hard to argue the value of creativity and originality, but I believe there is still value in the traditional approach. I have found that there is a growing interest among younger people, both Chinese and non-Chinese, in ink art, both contemporary and classical. In this age of giant screen TVs, virtual reality, immersive Van Gogh exhibitions, NFTs, and a nonstop barrage of digital sounds and images, ink painting, with its nuanced tones of gray, can be a perfect antidote to the polarized world of black and white extremes that we find ourselves living in today. Without using the term literati painting, we can still imagine an art form that negotiates its way between the extremes of realism and abstraction, a kind of painting for which the process is more important than the result, where the goal is self-discovery and self-cultivation rather than fame and fortune, a kind of painting that is meant to be studied and contemplated in small gatherings of friends, to be brought out and unrolled when the mood is right, rather than being permanently affixed to a spot on the wall. A kind of art that can communicate across time and across cultures, because each stroke of ink brushed onto an absorbent surface leaves a trace of the artist's intellect and spirit. A kind of art that helps to develop one's creativity and does not rely purely on innate talent. Traditional literati style painting was not designed to appeal to everyone, and it need not compete with other forms of ink art or art in general. But if it can attract the attention of a kid who grew up in New York City in the 1960s, I'm confident that Shui Moahua will continue to thrive and evolve into the distant future. Thanks.
Well, I'm Julianne Schubert. I'm the director of the Center for Asian Research, and I want to thank you for this very broad and sweeping engagement with Chinese ink painting. I'm not a specialist, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you very much for it. I've been asked to moderate the discussion, and there are already a number of questions in the chat box. So If I'm not taking them in sequence, please bear with me. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can in the remaining time. So let me begin by asking or repeating the following question. Dear Professor Chang, thank you so much for giving us this wonderful lecture. When you ask, how do we define Chinese art? You mentioned that Chinese artists are ethnically defined. Could you explain where other ethnic artists, particularly minority artists, fit into Chinese art?
That's a big question. I think this is just like some of the other issues I raised. It's not something that's easily answered, and it really depends on the context of the conversation, I guess is what I would say. And you know, sometimes we think we know what is Chinese art, and as I said, it's even to question what it means to be Chinese is a big question. I can't really talk about ethnic minority artists in China because I don't really know that much about it. But even for me, as somebody who grew up in America, there are issues. Well, you can see with the Olympics, there are all kinds of issues that combine or that touch on ethnicity and identity and nationality that get very, very complicated. So I think all of us who are trying to understand this stuff need to at least understand when somebody else, we need to define the terms as we're using them in conversation and realize that sometimes these terms are imposed on us from outside forces. I guess I'd leave it at that.
Okay.
I prefer not to define them at all, but I think, you know, I guess for me, the essence is let's go back to look at the art and let's talk about the art. And in many cases, the questions answer themselves.
All right, so here is another question that is along similar lines. And it asks, what is the difference between Chinese and Japanese paintings?
Well, are you serious?
This is in the chat box, so.
That's a different, I mean, again, there's lots of different kinds of Japanese painting. There's lots of different kinds of Chinese painting. So it really, I think we have to be more specific about what kind of art we're talking about.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And then there's another question. Looking longer term, how do you relate 20th century ink painting to the classical tradition? There were innovators in many past periods, and there are also similarities among the artists you featured and painters of the 17th, 14th, and 11th century. What do you think are good ways to compare and contrast these works across time?
I see that's a question from my friend David Lane, who always asks difficult questions. But I really appreciate that question because when we're talking about Chinese painting, you know, there are many different kinds of Chinese painting, and what that's why I say the term shui mo hua, this sort of over, not very specific term, allows us to include all kinds of things that might be excluded by other kinds of terms. But in this case, if you are an artist working within the tradition of the great tradition of Chinese ink painting, then it makes sense. Often, I really appreciate the approach of talking in terms of lineages. That is to say, painters who are working in similar modes, similar styles, across time. In other words, we tend to look at art history kind of horizontally, what was happening at any particular year, any particular dynasty, any particular time across the board. But artists themselves are not necessarily looking in the same way. For example, in the 17th century, you have an artist, Dong Chang, who really doesn't really appreciate much of what's going on around him. He would rather look back to earlier periods and find his inspiration there. And this, I think, is one of the features of this so-called literati painting tradition that is actually very interesting. It's art that's based on earlier art. And one places oneself within a tradition that transcends the immediate time. And I think that's what the questioner David is getting at, is that no matter when you're working, you can find artists in the past who kind of resonate with your own sensibilities. And that's the way that one, in other words, you go back in the time in order to find new ways to express yourself, rather than just simply adapting to what's going on around you, which you also have to do because you're living in a certain time.
Well, these are very stimulating questions and answers that give a lot of food for thought. I want to thank you and for a fantastic presentation. It was a real pleasure to have you here. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Janet or Claudia, would you like to add anything?
Yes, thank you. On behalf of Phoenix Art Museum, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Claudia Brown, Dr. Julianne Schubert, and Chen Lun, all of whom are fine colleagues at ASU. We are also very grateful for the memory and dedication of Marilyn A. Papp, benefactor, collector, and donor of traditional Chinese painting, whose vision has created the opportunity for many to appreciate and understand Chinese painting in the 21st century. Thank you also to the generosity of her family, especially her son, Harry, and his wife, Rose Papp. We are happy that all of you joined us today for this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. See you soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Arnold. Great talk.
Looks like Claudia. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arnold. I wanted to add that Arnold Chang was our first presenter in the Marilyn Papp Unrolling the Scrolls series. And at that time, he gave a course for ASU. And that course included many wonderful events, but especially a painting demonstration, which I still remember vividly. And we hope that perhaps you'd do that for us again one day. I should also add that we have 60 paintings in the Phoenix Art Museum collection from Marilyn and Roy Papp. So those are here to be studied by current and future students. Thank you. Thank you, Arnold.
You're very welcome. Hope to see you in person soon.
Yeah.
谢谢大家。
Okay, thank you, everyone.